Would you give away your last piece of bread to someone who looked like nothing more than a shadow in the dirt? Someone whose face you could not see, whose voice barely rose above a whisper? Would you do it if the world around you had already taken everything else from you? In the choking haze of Verac Prime's dusk, the sky hung like rusted iron. It wasn't a sky meant for dreaming. It was a lid, heavy and low, pressing down on a city that no longer looked up. Neon signs flickered half-heartedly above market stalls built from scrap, the kind of light that didn't illuminate, just reminded everyone how dark everything else had become. The air smelled of burnt circuits and old meat. Beneath it all moved people, not walking but surviving, shoulders hunched, eyes down, voices reduced to transactions and excuses. And there, in the smallest alley near Sector 6's Overflow Market, was Iran Wade. 17 years old, human. Bone-thin but wiry. The kind of face that looked older than it should, with eyes that had learned to be quiet in a place that punished attention. He wore layered shirts stitched from discarded uniforms and an old scarf wrapped around his throat, not for warmth, but to filter the metallic dust that clung to every breath. He was holding a ration cube, slightly cracked, a meal ticket he'd bartered for after a full day cleaning out waste ports for a merchant family that didn't bother learning his name. The cube was supposed to last a full day. It wouldn't. He hadn't eaten yesterday. It had rained acid that morning, and he'd given his last water tablet to a girl whose brother was coughing blood. Now, as he sat under the broken remains of a transit arch, he unwrapped the cube with fingers that trembled just enough to betray the truth. He was starving. But before he could bring it to his lips, he heard the cough. Software wet, hidden. He turned his head slowly and saw her. A shape hunched near the wall, wrapped in a cloak that looked more like old tarp than fabric, face obscured beneath a low hood, hands blackened by dust and time. She was small, smaller than him, barely breathing. He looked away. You didn't look at beggars on Verac Prime. Not unless you wanted trouble. Not unless you wanted the guilt to chew on you when you had nothing to give. He took a bite. But the coughing didn't stop. His fingers clenched around the cube. Then he sighed, a sound too old for a boy his age. He stood, walked over, and crouched beside the figure. He held out the cube. Here. She didn't move at first, as if unsure the world had actually spoken to her. Then slowly, painfully, her hand reached out. The fingers were thin, alien, not human. They shook as they took the food. She didn't say, "Thank you." She just pulled the cube under the hood. He turned to leave, but her hand caught his wrist. He froze. Her grip was light, but her touch felt electric. Not painful, not warm, just known. Like memory wrapped in skin. Then her voice, rough and cracked, no louder than breath. "You saw me." He frowned. She let go, and without another word, curled into herself and disappeared into the corner like a fading breath. Aaron walked away. He didn't look back. But the weight of her hand stayed on his skin. That night he dreamt of fire, not flames, but light. A throne made of something older than stone, floating in a void of stars. A woman sat on it, cloaked in gold, her face hidden beneath the same kind of hood. She looked at him. She smiled. Then the stars collapsed into silence. He woke with a gasp. The sky above his sleeping place had turned violet. Morning was bleeding in through the cracks in the metal ceiling. Aaron sat up slowly, rubbing his face. Then he noticed something tucked into the side of his scarf. A thread. Golden. Thin as hair, glowing faintly. He looked around. No one. He pulled the thread free and held it to the light. It shimmered. Then, from far off, beyond the markets, beyond the walls, he heard something he hadn't heard in weeks. Engines, not city vehicles, not merchant haulers. Ships, moving fast, too fast. And the sky, was it darker than usual? He turned to the alley where he'd seen her. Empty. But something in him shifted, like a door had opened, and something old had stepped through. What would you do if someone started watching you, not like a threat, but like a test? Not to hurt you, but to see who you are when no one else is looking. Would you notice, before it was too late to pretend? The golden thread Aaron found hadn't vanished by morning. In fact, when the sunlight finally sliced through the polluted haze of Virac Prime, it seemed to glow even stronger. He had tucked it into the inside of his scarf, though part of him wondered if it was safer to throw it away. It was just a thread, thin, weightless, but somehow it made his chest feel heavy. He didn't go back to the alley that morning. He wanted to. Something in him ached to check, to see if she was still there, the beggar, the one who said, "You saw me." But Aaron had learned a long time ago that when people on Virac Prime disappeared, they usually stayed that way. Instead, he slipped back into the current of the market. His feet moved on memory, dodging crates, shouting merchants, the two slick tiles near the fishmonger stalls. Alien species from 100 systems wandered the lanes. Most never looked twice at a human like him. But today felt off. At first, he couldn't place it. Nothing looked different. Nothing sounded wrong. But the space around him felt narrower, like the world was watching from just behind the curtain. When he cut through the back corridor behind the ventilation hubs, a shortcut he'd used for years, he saw him. The man. Tall. Heavy coat. Standing still, arms crossed. Aaron stopped walking. The man didn't move. They stared at each other. The man blinked once, then turned and walked away. No words, no threat, just left. Aaron stood in that corridor for too long. He didn't see the man again that day, but he felt him, watching, from rooftops, from corners, from shadows. That night, Aaron didn't sleep well. The next morning, he returned to the alley. It was empty, but a message had been carved into the metal wall, low, near the ground, where only someone sitting in the dirt might reach. "Thank you." Aaron reached out to touch it. Then he heard the voice. Quiet, from behind. "You're not like the others." He spun. It was the man in the coat, closer now, older, hard face, eyes like dried iron, cold, unbending. "Who are you?" Aaron asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the wall. "You gave something away without expecting it back." "That matters." Aaron frowned. "I gave her bread. That's it. Number. You gave her dignity." The man took a step closer. "Do you know who she was?" Aaron shook his head. "She didn't say. Of course she didn't. That's why she chose you." Aaron's breath caught. "She chose." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. A hollow emitter. He pressed it once and tossed it onto the ground. A figure shimmered into view. The beggar. Standing tall, face still hidden. Then the hood fell. She was radiant. Not beautiful in the way the street posters painted beauty, but radiant, like she didn't belong in a world full of rust and hunger. High cheekbones, eyes like burnished silver, and across her forehead, a mark, a sigil shaped like a rising flame enclosed by wings. Aaron stared. "Who is she?" The man's voice dropped to something between reverence and warning. "She is Kyla Demir, the lost queen of the Triad Crown." Aaron laughed, but it cracked halfway. "That's a myth." The man didn't smile. "So are gods, until they return." Aaron's pulse kicked. "Why me?" The man shrugged. "Maybe because you didn't ask who she was before you gave her what you had. Maybe that's what she was waiting for." He turned, began walking away. "Wait," Aaron called. The man paused. "Who are you?" "Thorn Rawl," he said, "used to wear a crowned shadow. Now I follow the light where it dares to appear." Then he disappeared into the city's noise. Aaron looked back at the message on the wall. "Thank you." The words shimmered slightly, and the golden thread in his scarf pulsed once, like a heartbeat. That night he dreamed again. This time, the throne room wasn't empty. Kayla stood at the base of the steps, looking directly at him. "You saw me," she said again, "and now they will see you." He woke with her name in his mouth. "Kayla, would you follow someone if they never asked, but everything in you told you to? Let us know in the comments. What if a throne could remember every soul who had ever sat on it? Every betrayal it had endured, every truth it had been forced to bury. And what if that throne whispered your name?" Aaron Wade had never left the lower city before. Varric Prime stretched for miles, levels upon levels of rust and steel and rotting power. Most humans never made it past the rim of Sector 5. Their lives were contracts, their dreams auctioned off by debt and ancestry. But now he was in the sky. The transport was old, no markings, no windows, just metal and silence, and the man named Thorn across from him. The cabin shuddered every time they rose a few more kilometers, but Thorn didn't flinch. Aaron clutched the seat rail with both hands, knuckles white. "You still haven't told me where we're going," he finally said. Thorn didn't look up. "Because if I had, you'd have run." That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. The ship groaned and tilted left, then steadied. Moments later, they dropped into shadow. The door opened. Aaron stepped out into a place that didn't look like Varric Prime. No noise, no people, no ash, just stone, smooth, black, stretching out like a forgotten temple. Pillars rose around them, some cracked, some covered in moss. Above, no ceiling, just the open sky, choked with clouds that seemed to shimmer with faint gold. "What is this place?" Thorn walked ahead. "It's called the Hollow Crown." Aaron frowned. "I thought the throne was destroyed, number just buried." They descended into the main hall, steps echoing across the vast, empty chamber. Along the walls, carvings shimmered faintly. Symbols Aaron didn't recognize. Wings, flames, hands holding stars. At the far end of the room sat a raised platform, and on it, a throne. Unlike anything Aaron had imagined, not gold, not silver, but a metal that pulsed, like veins ran through it, like it breathed. It wasn't just a seat, it was watching. He stopped walking. "Go on," Thorn said behind him. "Why me? That's the wrong question. Then what's the right one? What do you believe you are?" Aaron took a step forward. The throne didn't move, but something inside him did. The golden thread in his scarf pulled tighter. Another step, then another. He stood before it. He wasn't sure why he raised his hand, but he did. And when his fingers touched the armrest, a pulse shot through the chamber. The light hit him in the chest. He didn't scream, but his body jolted like it remembered every pain he'd ever hidden. His knees buckled. He dropped to the ground. And then he saw. Not visions, memories, 1,000 lifetimes, voices. A woman screaming for mercy. A child on a battlefield. A soldier standing alone as cities burned behind him. The sound of betrayal. The scent of ash. The cold weight of judgment. And through it all, one thread, one heartbeat, one choice, kindness, every time. Aaron collapsed. Thorn rushed forward, caught him before his head hit the floor. "He's still breathing," the older man muttered. Behind them, the throne glowed brighter. Kayla stepped into the chamber, not as a beggar, not as a ghost, but as the queen she was always meant to be. Thorn lowered Aaron gently. Kayla knelt beside him. "He found the light," she whispered. Number Thorn corrected. "It found him." Aaron's eyes opened. They locked onto hers. "You?" "Yes." He sat up slowly. "Why me?" Because you didn't want anything from me. Because when the galaxy turned its face away, you didn't." She placed her hand on his chest. "And now, the throne knows you." A loud hum filled the chamber. The walls began to shift. Rings of ancient energy circled the ceiling. Symbols lighting, one by one. The hollow crown was awakening. "What's happening?" Aaron asked, voice shaking. "It's choosing," Kayla said. "Choosing what?" Kayla looked at him, not what. Who? If someone handed you a future you didn't ask for, wrapped in memory, loss, and light, would you carry it for them? Not for glory, not for reward, but because your soul couldn't leave them to walk alone. The hollow crown remained silent for the rest of the night. No more pulses, no more visions, just quiet, deep and old, as if the chamber itself had gone back to sleep, content that someone had finally touched its memory again. Aaron Wade sat against the base of the ancient throne, his eyes wide open but not seeing. Kayla Demir knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other resting against her own chest as if to steady something inside. He hadn't spoken since the visions hit him, but his breathing had slowed. That meant something. Thorn Rahl stood a few feet away, arms crossed, face unreadable. Even he had never sat upon the throne. Even he had only heard whispers of what it showed to those it deemed worthy. "You saw the fire, didn't you?" Thorn said quietly. Aaron blinked. "It wasn't fire," he said slowly. "It was grief. 1,000 voices burning through me." Kayla looked down. That's what it remembers, not power, not lineage, but pain carried without bitterness. Aaron turned to her. "Why do you sound like you felt it?" "Because I have," she whispered. "Years ago, when I was a child hiding in the Palace of Mirrors, I touched it. Just once. It showed me silence, empty halls, a kingdom that would forget me." She exhaled slowly, and then it went dark. Until now. Aaron sat up straighter. "The light came back when I touched it?" Kayla nodded. "Because you are the first soul in generations that gave without asking. It knows. It remembers." He looked down at his hands. They still shook. He could still feel the echo of those lifetimes. So many faces, so many falls, but all bound together by something gentle. He looked back up at her. "So what now?" Kayla hesitated, then said, "We run." Aaron blinked. "What?" "There are those who will kill to keep the throne quiet. The mark has chosen you. That cannot be undone." Thorn nodded. "General Vorsk has ears in every sector. He'll feel the tremor. He'll come looking." Aaron stood. "Then let him." "You think you're ready for him?" Thorn asked. "No," Aaron said. "But I'm not running from something just because I don't understand it." Thorn smiled faintly. Maybe the throne chose right after all. Kayla stepped closer. "We need to go deeper. There's another chamber. One the general doesn't know exists. It's where the first oath was taken." "The oath?" Kayla looked away. "It's not a spell. It's not a vow. It's a choice you make in front of something older than law. It remembers too." Aaron followed her through a hidden passage carved beneath the throne dais. The air grew colder. The walls changed, less polished, more like living stone. Etchings covered every surface, lines upon lines of names written in dozens of languages. And ahead, a single pedestal, stone, unadorned. Upon it, a blade. It wasn't ceremonial. It was scarred, chipped, its hilt wrapped in faded cloth. "What is this?" Aaron asked. "The sword of the first one," Kayla said. "The first to swear never to use power for conquest." She reached out and lifted it, then turned the hilt toward him. "You don't have to take it. The throne chose you for who you are, not who you could become. This is only if you choose to walk the path with me." He stared at the blade. It was heavy even before he touched it, but he took it, his hand wrapped around the cloth. He didn't speak. Neither did she, but something passed between them, not romance, not duty, something simpler. Trust. He turned the blade in his hand and lowered it. Then looked at Kayla. I won't let you stand alone. She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. Above them, the air vibrated. The throne chamber pulsed once more. Not loud, but enough. Thorn's voice echoed down. We've got movement, drones in the outer ring. He's found us. Aaron looked at Kayla, then at the sword. He wasn't ready, but he wasn't afraid either. If you had the chance to send one message, just one, that could awaken hope in a world built on silence, would you risk everything to say it? The warning came not with blaring alarms, but with stillness. A hush that moved through the hollow crown like the pause between lightning and thunder. Thorn Rahl knew that kind of stillness. He'd heard it before, in the moments before things cracked, fell, and changed forever. Aaron Wade stood near the central balcony, watching the ash-laced clouds outside churn with pressure. The signal had gone out. The message was no longer just words. It had become airwaves, photons, memory. Somewhere beyond the city, somewhere in those towers where Empire hands rested heavily on broken thrones, someone now knew that Kayla Demir had returned. And worse, they knew he had spoken her name. Thorn approached carefully, boots echoing on stone still recovering from the throne's pulse. They're coming, he said. Aaron didn't respond. His hands rested on the rail, fingers white-knuckled but still. Kayla appeared next, her steps softer, cloak trailing over fractured mosaics that once told stories no one remembered. He didn't look at her either. It's done, Aaron finally whispered. The message is out. Kayla nodded, and he exhaled slowly. It felt small. That's because it is, she said, until someone hears it. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. That's how change always begins. Thorn cleared his throat. We have minutes. Drones first, then the elites. They'll want to erase the source before the words take root. Then let them try, Aaron said. The control chamber below the throne had gone dark after the signal burst. Old conduits, some thought lost to time, had glowed bright for 5 seconds and burned out again, their work done. Thorn and Kayla gathered what they could, supplies, maps, even a half-working holorecorder. Aaron stayed behind. He wandered the throne hall slowly, looking at the stone like it might whisper again. It didn't, but he could still feel the hum, deep beneath his skin. The kind of memory that doesn't fade. They didn't come all at once. The first soldiers arrived like shadows, testing the walls, looking for cracks. Kayla watched them through the slit in the outer gate, heart heavy, but posture unyielding. She didn't command them to stop, she didn't plead, she waited, and then one stepped through. Helmeted, armored, weapon drawn, but hands uncertain. He looked at her, at the glowing marks across her palms, at the throne behind her, and lowered his rifle. More came after him. Not all followed suit. Some raised weapons. Some shouted commands. But hesitation rippled through their ranks like water through cracked stone. Aaron emerged from the corridor, sword at his side, no armor to shield him. Only resolve. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. One soldier stepped back. Then another. Some chose to fight. But some chose to remember. The air cracked with the scream of metal against energy as the firefight began. But it wasn't war. It was confusion. Fear. No one truly wanted to be there. No one wanted to be the one to strike first. Thorn barked commands, pulling Kayla behind cover. Aaron deflected a strike meant for her, not with technique, but with instinct. The blade pulsed once, bright as the throne's memory, and the attacker fell back, dazed, weapon dropped. Kyla shouted, "Enough," and the chamber fell still. Outside, the rest of the soldiers stood frozen, and then, like wind shifting directions, they turned and left. Not defeated, just uncertain. Aaron dropped to one knee, not from injury, from weight. Kayla knelt beside him. "It's beginning," she said. "No," he replied softly. "It's ending." The silence settled over them again, not empty this time, but full. Full of the things not yet spoken, of names once forgotten, of the fire still carried quietly in those who dared to remember. What if surviving wasn't the end of your story? What if getting away was just the beginning of being known? The night after the soldiers withdrew was the quietest Verac Prime had heard in years. No sirens, no hovering patrols, no amplified threats barked from speakers above the skyline, just wind, and the distant sound of power returning to the lower grids, soft, flickering pulses like a heart learning how to beat again. Inside the hollow crown, the survivors moved carefully, each footstep an echo. They gathered in the lower sanctum, where the ceiling had cracked just enough to let in a shaft of moonlight that painted the room in silver and stone. Kayla stood at the center, her cloak gone, her shoulders bare, the crest of her bloodline glowing faintly beneath her skin. She didn't speak until everyone had entered. "We leave tonight," she said. Some flinched, others nodded. "We've lit a spark, but sparks burn fast when they're alone." Aaron Wade leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over the blade he still didn't know how to use. He hadn't slept since the message went out. Part of him didn't want to. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant memory, of fire, of faces, of names he couldn't forget. He stepped forward now, clearing his throat. "Where are we going?" Kayla looked at Thorne, who nodded. "There's a place on the edge of the Arctel Drift. It's not on the maps anymore. Used to be a listening post, then a trading hub, then a graveyard. Now it's where those who remember go when they're tired of pretending." Aaron blinked. "And we think they'll help us?" Kayla's voice didn't waver. "They already have." No one questioned her further. They moved through the lower passageways quickly. The hidden lift beneath the throne's platform creaked once, then descended into the depths of the mountain. At the bottom, a hangar, long abandoned but still functional. The ship was waiting. It wasn't beautiful. In fact, it was ugly. Old plating, scorch marks, welded patches from past battles long buried. But it was real, and it still flew. Kayla placed her hand on the hull. The ship responded, systems humming awake. Lights flickered to life along the landing ramp. "This ship once belonged to my mother," she said softly. Before everything fell. Aaron watched her closely. He hadn't asked much about Kyla's past. She rarely offered it. But now, he realized, he didn't need details. He could see it in how she touched the controls, in how she carried herself when no one was watching. She was not someone trying to be royal. She was someone remembering how. Thorne loaded supplies without speaking. His movements were efficient, practiced. But occasionally, he'd glance at Aaron, not judgment, not approval, something quieter, recognition, like seeing an old reflection in a younger mirror. The ship lifted off just past midnight. No fanfare, no goodbyes, only the soft hum of engines cutting through the quiet. Verac Prime faded beneath them. Lights shrinking, streets curling inward. The hollow crown, hidden beneath the cliffs, disappeared into shadow once more. Aaron stood by the rear viewport, arms resting on the frame. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Kayla didn't answer immediately, then quietly, "Yes." He nodded. "Good." Hours passed in silence. Then Kayla appeared beside him again. She held something in her hand. It was the thread, the golden one. "You kept it?" he asked. She looked at him. I never let go." He took it from her gently and tied it around his wrist. "What does it mean that you were seen? By who? By me." He didn't speak again for a long time, not until they crossed into deep drift space, where stars looked older and gravity hummed like a whisper. He leaned his head back against the wall and finally let himself sleep. What would you do if the very people you hoped to save began to fear what you had become? The drift was quiet for 3 days, beyond the edge of known charts, past the border where empires once claimed dominion and let the void reclaim their pride. The old freighter carved its path through ion storms and dead frequencies. The ship creaked, not from age alone, but as if it too held its breath alongside the passengers within. Aaron Wade spent most of his time awake. He walked the narrow corridors of the vessel when others slept, not from duty but from unease. The dreams hadn't stopped. Sometimes they weren't dreams at all. Sometimes they were voices, memories, echoes of the throne, of people long gone who spoke in languages he didn't understand, but whose grief he felt like static under the skin. He'd tried to stay quiet about it, tried to be normal, tried to pretend he hadn't changed the moment he touched that throne. But change has its own scent, and fear follows it. It started small, whispers, a sideways glance from one of the soldiers who had followed them from the hollow crown. The quiet way someone would step out of the corridor when he passed, not with anger, but with uncertainty, like he was something fragile or dangerous. On the 4th day it broke, a systems failure, minor, routine, but panic has a way of inflating the ordinary into the unthinkable. A power relay sparked in the rear engine bay. Lights flickered across the ship. A single shout was all it took. Someone screamed it was him, that the throne's power was leaking from his skin, that he was no longer just a man, that he was a weapon. By the time Thorne reached the engine room, 3 crew had locked themselves inside the storage hold and refused to come out until Aaron was restrained. Kyla stood in the hallway, her voice calm but fierce. "You forget who gave you a chance to stand again." They looked at her, then at Aaron. He didn't speak. He didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed the sword on the ground between them. "If it helps you sleep," he said, "take it." Thorne growled from behind. "You're not giving them anything. They followed you because they saw the truth." "And now they doubt it?" Aaron replied. "Maybe they're right to." Kayla stepped between him and the others. "Number?" But she didn't yell, she didn't plead, she knelt, not to beg, to remind them what it looked like when someone chose humility over fear. She reached out and picked up the sword, held it in her palms, and handed it back to Aaron. "You carry it not because it makes you powerful," she said, "but because you were willing to lay it down." The crew watched, some ashamed, some still unsure, but none spoke again. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed. It softened. They reached the outer orbit of the Arctel drift on the 5th night. A station floated in darkness, broken, half-lit, but alive. Kayla stood beside Aaron at the viewport. "Are you ready?" she asked. He turned to her. "Number." She smiled. "Good. That means you'll walk carefully." The ship docked without ceremony, no banners, no fanfare. But when the ramp descended, and Kayla stepped onto the cracked platform with Aaron at her side, someone was already waiting. An old woman in a faded cloak, her hands covered in rings. She looked at Kayla, then at Aaron, and smiled. "You brought him," she said. Kayla nodded. "He brought himself." The woman turned, walking slowly into the shadows of the station's halls. "Come then," she said. "The others are waiting." Aaron followed. Not because he had answers, but because the voice inside him would no longer stay silent. There are moments when a name stops being just a sound. when it becomes a spark, a direction, a reason someone halfway across a broken world decides to rise one more time. Would you carry that weight if it meant never being unknown again? The station was older than it looked. At first glance, it was rust and salvage and time left to rot. But deeper in, beneath the surface of its quiet corridors and blinking panels, it breathed, like something long buried was slowly learning to exhale. Power still hummed faintly in the walls. Doors responded not to code, but to memory. Aaron Wade walked behind the old woman in silence. Kayla at his side. Thorne a few paces behind. They passed murals covered in dust. Faces drawn in firelight, hands reaching upward. Symbols of wings and threads and the flame that never went out. The further they walked, the more he felt it. He wasn't here to be crowned. He was here to be known. The chamber opened with a slow sigh. Round, circular. 17 figures stood in a wide arc. Some wore armor, some robes. Some had no flesh at all. Machine minds. Forgotten seers. Former enemies. But they were all watching. The woman who led them in stepped aside and nodded. "Speak." Kayla turned to Aaron. He waited for the shaking in his chest to pass. Then he stepped forward. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," he admitted. A few heads tilted. "I didn't come here to lead. I didn't come here to ignite a war. I gave a piece of bread to someone who needed it, that's all." Silence. But sometimes the smallest truth cuts through the thickest lies. I didn't know who Kayla was. I didn't ask. I didn't think helping her would make me anyone. But now I stand here, not because I want power, but because something in me can't look away anymore. A voice spoke from the far end. "And what would you have us do?" Aaron looked around the room. "Remember." Another voice followed. "Hope does not win wars." "No, but it survives them." Kayla stepped forward. "You don't have to follow him, but you should know this. The throne chose. The people are listening again. The Empire cannot hold back memory forever." One of the oldest machines leaned forward. "Memory is not action. Then maybe it is time to act on what we remember." The council fell into low conversation. Murmurs, debate. Aaron stepped back. His hand still trembled, but not from fear, from weight. Kayla leaned in. You were heard. Thorne touched his shoulder. And now they move. The chamber pulsed once. A quiet chime, decision. When they left, the hall behind them lit in soft gold. A path forward. They didn't speak much on the way back to the ship. The corridor felt different now. Like the silence had shape. Like it watched with approval. Hours later, as the ship departed the station, Kayla sat across from Aaron at the table between the bunks. "You still carry the thread?" He nodded. "I think it carries me now." She smiled. "Good, let it." They didn't speak again that night. But when he closed his eyes, the dreams were quieter. Not gone, but gentle. Not fire, light. And somewhere across the stars, in 100 cities built on stories, a new one began. About a boy who gave away his last piece of bread and started a revolution by seeing someone no one else would. If that story meant something to you, share it below. Tell us what part stayed with you. We read every word.